The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the oak-paneled walls of the library. Outside Wyoming, wind howled through the valley that had once been wilderness but now held the beginnings of civilization. Samuel Blackwell sat in his leather chair watching the flames, with eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything. Across from him, his grandson William leaned forward, 7 years old and hungry for stories the way only boys that age can be. The kind of hunger that wants to understand what it means to be a man in a world that doesn't hand out easy answers. Samuel was 53 now, his hair more silver than dark, his face weathered by decades of Wyoming sun and wind. The lines around his eyes spoke of laughter and pain in equal measure. His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, bore the scars of a life lived with purpose. William broke the comfortable silence. His voice carried that adolescent crack between boy and man. "Grandfather, my teacher at school, says Wyoming was dangerous in the old days. Real dangerous. Were you scared when you lived up here all alone?" Samuel's gaze remained on the fire for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, the voice of a man who had learned the value of words spoken carefully. "Alone. No son. In 1875, when I came back to Ironstone Valley, I was never alone. There was a woman, the bravest person I ever met. And there was a child who taught me what it really means to be strong." He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to touch a chain around his neck. Hidden beneath his shirt hung a gold ring worn smooth by time and memory. "Let me tell you about the year I was 33 years old. The year I thought I could hide from my past, thought I could pretend to be someone I wasn't. That was the year a Boston seamstress with debts she couldn't pay, and a little girl I was too ashamed to claim as my own taught me that running from the truth only makes it chase you harder." William's eyes widened. This was a story he had never heard, not in all the tales his grandfather had told him. Samuel leaned back, and his voice took on the cadence of memory of truth that had been carried for 20 years. "This isn't a story about heroes, William. This is a story about ordinary people who were forced to fight, and in fighting they learned what family really means." The old man's eyes closed briefly, and when they opened again, they seemed to look past his grandson, past the comfortable room, past the present moment entirely. He was seeing another time, another version of himself. 20 years ago I was a different man, and this is how it began. The scene dissolved like smoke, and we were no longer in the warm library of 1895. We were in Boston, Massachusetts in October of 1875, where rain fell cold and unforgiving on cobblestone streets. Boston did not welcome the poor. It tolerated them, squeezed them into tenements and dark alleys, extracted what labor it could, and offered nothing in return but the promise of another hard day. The rain that fell that October evening made the cobblestones slick and treacherous, reflecting the gas lamps in pools of oily light. Margaret Thorne moved through the evening crowd with her head down and her shoulders hunched against the cold. She was 24 years old, and 3 months ago she had buried her father. The consumption had taken him slowly, eating away at his lungs, while the debt collectors circled like vultures, waiting for the inevitable. $2,000. That was what her father owed a man named Tobias Crowley, and Crowley was not a patient creditor. He employed men who knew how to collect debts that could not be paid with money alone. Maggie's fingers tightened around the newspaper clipping in her coat pocket. She had read it so many times the paper had grown soft and threatened to tear along the creases. The words were burned into her memory. "Wanted wife. Must be of sturdy constitution and honest character. Life is hard. Solitude is absolute. I offer a roof and protection. I offer no luxuries. Write to Samuel Blackwell, Ironstone Valley, Wyoming Territory." It was the bleakest marriage proposal she had ever seen. No promises of love, no mention of comfort or companionship, just hard work and a roof. But that single word had caught her attention like a fishhook snagging flesh. Protection. She needed protection more than she needed anything else in this world. Protection from Vincent Walsh, the dead-eyed man who worked for Crowley. Protection from a debt she would never be able to repay, no matter how many hymns she sewed or how many hours she worked. Maggie turned the corner onto Wharf Street and stopped. Standing in front of her boarding house, leaning against the gas lamp with studied casualness, was Walsh himself. He was picking his teeth with a splinter of wood, his eyes scanning the street with the patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. She did not hesitate. Maggie spun on her heel and walked quickly in the opposite direction, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her she heard Walsh's voice call out sharp and mocking, "Running won't help Miss Thorne. Crowley always collects." She ducked into an alley, her boots splashing through puddles, and emerged onto a parallel street. The train station. She needed to get to the train station. The ticket was already purchased, paid for, with the last of her savings and money sent by the man in Wyoming. Samuel Blackwell, a stranger who had answered her desperate telegram with a simple reply. "Come alone. Tell no one." She had written to him 3 weeks ago, her hand shaking as she composed the letter. She had been honest, brutally so, because she had nothing left to lose. She told him about her father's death, about the debt, about the fact that she needed to disappear and could not afford to be particular about where she disappeared to. His response had been immediate. A telegraph with money for a third-class ticket on the Union Pacific line, and those 3 words, "Come alone. Tell no one." She had obeyed. She had told no one. She had packed a single bag with her few possessions, left her mother's locket hidden in the boarding house because there was no time to retrieve it, and now she was running through Boston in the rain, running toward a train that would take her west to a man she had never met and a life she could not imagine. The train station loomed ahead, its iron and glass structure belching steam into the gray sky. Maggie pushed through the crowd, ignoring the protests of well-dressed travelers who objected to being jostled by a woman in a threadbare coat. She found her platform, showed her ticket to the conductor with trembling hands, and climbed aboard the third-class car. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and coal dust. She squeezed onto a wooden bench between a Swedish family with 3 crying children and an old man who reeked of whiskey. As the train lurched into motion, she allowed herself one look back at the city where she had been born. Boston's skyline receded into the rain and smoke. She would never see it again, and she felt no sadness at the thought. Only relief, cold and sharp, that she was leaving. That Vincent Walsh would not find her in Wyoming. That Tobias Crowley's reach, however long, could not stretch across 2,000 miles of wilderness. The journey west was a blur of changing landscapes. The cramped brick cities of the east gave way to rolling farmland, then to the vast emptiness of the Great Plains. 4 days of rattling tracks, of trying to sleep, sitting upright, of eating stale bread and cheese because hot meals in the dining car were beyond her means. By the time the train pulled into Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, Maggie felt like she had shed her skin somewhere along the journey. She was not the same woman who had fled Boston. She could not afford to be. The West demanded a different kind of strength, and she would learn to possess it, or she would not survive. She stepped down onto the wooden platform at Cheyenne Station, and the wind hit her like a physical blow. It was late October, and the air here had teeth. It cut through her coat and made her eyes water. Around her the platform was chaos. Cowboys shouted at each other in rough voices. Freight wagons rumbled past. From the saloons that lined the street, music spilled out into the afternoon, discordant and too loud. A voice cut through the noise, deep and gravelly, like stones grinding together in a riverbed. "Margaret Thorne." It was not a question. She turned, and for a moment fear replaced the relief she had been feeling. The man who stood before her was terrifying. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the afternoon sun. He wore a duster coat that had once been tan, but was now stained with mud and oil, the hem torn and ragged. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see his eyes, dark blue, intense, and watching her with an expression she could not read. His beard was thick and unkempt, covering half his face, but it was the boots that drew her attention. The leather was peeling, the soles worn thin, and the left boot was held together with twine wrapped around the toe to keep the sole from flapping loose. This was Samuel Blackwell. This was the man who had sent her money for a train ticket, who had promised her protection and a roof. He looked destitute. He looked like a man who had lost every fight with this land and was simply waiting to die. Maggie felt something cold and heavy settle in her stomach. She had traded one kind of desperation for another. "Mr. Blackwell." Her voice came out smaller than she intended, almost lost in the noise of the station. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He simply nodded once, a sharp, economical movement. "Wagons this way." He bent and scooped up her battered valise as if it weighed nothing, then turned and walked toward the far end of the station. Maggie followed because she had no other choice. What else could she do? She had no money for a return ticket. She had nowhere else to go. They walked past the nice carriages, past the sturdy freight wagons, all the way to the very edge of the lot. There sat a buckboard wagon that looked like it had survived a war. The wood was gray and splintering. The wheels were held together with wire. The horse hitched to it was a massive roan with scars along its flanks and a mean look in its eye. Samuel tossed her bag into the back of the wagon with a thud, then climbed up onto the driver's seat. The wood groaned under his weight. He looked down at her, waiting. "You coming?" Maggie glanced back at the town behind her. Cheyenne was rough and wild, but it was civilization. There would be work here if she looked for it. She could be a maid, a washerwoman, something that would allow her to survive. But Vincent Walsh was a determined man. If he tracked her this far, he would find her here. She set her jaw, lifted her skirts, and climbed up beside Samuel Blackwell. The seat was hard and narrow, offering no comfort. "Let's go," she said quietly. Samuel flicked the reins and the wagon lurched into motion. They rolled out of Cheyenne and into the vast emptiness of Wyoming territory. For the first 4 hours, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the horse's hooves. Maggie tried to study Samuel from the corner of her eye without being obvious about it. His hands on the reins were rough, the knuckles scarred and swollen. These were not the hands of a farmer. She had seen farmers' hands before, calloused from holding plow handles and pitchforks. These hands bore different scars, the kind that came from precise work with tools, the kind of scars an engineer or a craftsman might have. His posture was rigid alert. He scanned the horizon constantly, his eyes moving from the ridges to the valleys, checking, always checking. This was the behavior of a soldier, not a homesteader. And beneath the grime and the torn coat, she noticed details that did not fit. The compass hanging from his belt was brass expensive. The rifle secured behind the seat was a Winchester well-maintained and clean. These were not the possessions of a man living in poverty, but his boots were falling apart, held together with twine. The contradiction nagged at her. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, Maggie broke the silence. "Your letter mentioned you need help caring for a child." Samuel's shoulders tensed. A long pause followed, and when he finally spoke, his voice was flat and carefully neutral. "Can you read?" The question surprised her. "I was educated through 8th grade. I can read, write, and do arithmetic." "Good. The child needs schooling." "Your daughter?" "Niece, orphan. She's 9 years old." There was pain in those clipped sentences, carefully controlled, but present nonetheless. Maggie pressed gently. "What's her name?" "Emily." Another long silence. It was clear Samuel did not want to talk about Emily, and Maggie could not understand why. If the child was the reason for this marriage arrangement, why did speaking of her cause him such obvious discomfort? As darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, Samuel reached behind the seat and pulled out a heavy wool blanket. He tossed it into her lap without a word. It smelled of wood smoke and horse, but it was thick and warm. Maggie pulled it around her shoulders gratefully. "Thank you," she murmured. He did not respond, but the gesture had been gentle, almost protective. The contradiction again. Harsh exterior but capable of small kindnesses. They crested a rise and the moonlight illuminated the landscape below. It was a valley bowl shaped and surrounded on 3 sides by jagged granite cliffs. In the center sat what could only generously be called a homestead. It was a sod house, literally built into the side of a hill with a front wall made of stacked logs and earth. The roof was grass and dirt. It looked less like a home and more like an animal's den. Beside it stood a barn leaning precariously to one side, its roof patched with rusted tin. A single lantern hung from a hook by the front door, swinging in the wind. "This is it," Samuel said, pulling the wagon to a halt. Maggie sat frozen. In Boston, even the poorest tenements had brick walls and wooden floors. This was dirt. She was going to live in dirt. Samuel climbed down and came around to help her from the wagon. His hands were firm but respectful on her waist as he lifted her down. For a moment their faces were close, and she could see his eyes clearly in the moonlight. They were not the eyes of a broken man. They were intelligent, intense, and deeply sad. "It isn't much," he said, his voice dropping lower, "but it's the safest place within 200 miles. No one can approach without me knowing." "Safe from who?" Maggie asked. "From everyone." Before she could press him further, there was a sound from the barn. A small figure emerged, running toward them with the unsteady gait of a child. She stopped a few feet away, and in the lantern light, Maggie could see her clearly. Emily was 9 years old, with long blonde hair that hung in tangles down her back. Her dress was too small, the hem riding up above her ankles, and it was patched in multiple places. But her face was clean, and her eyes were bright with intelligence and hope. "Uncle Samuel!" The child's voice was high and excited. "You're back." Then she saw Maggie, and the excitement died. Her expression shifted to something more guarded. Fear and hope mixed together in equal measure. Samuel's voice was gentle when he spoke to the child. "Emily, this is Mrs. Thorne. She's going to be staying with us." Emily took a tentative step forward, studying Maggie with an intensity that was unsettling in someone so young. "Like Mrs. Henderson?" Samuel tensed visibly. "No. Mrs. Thorne is going to stay longer." Emily approached slowly like a deer approaching a stranger's hand. She looked Maggie up and down, taking in every detail. "Do you know how to read?" Emily asked. Maggie knelt down so they were at eye level. "Yes. Do you like books?" "Uncle has lots of books, but he doesn't have time to read to me very often." "Then we'll read together. Would you like that?" A small smile appeared on Emily's face, then vanished just as quickly. She looked at Samuel, and the question in her eyes was painful to see. "She's going to stay, isn't she? You promise?" Samuel looked away, unable to meet the child's gaze. His jaw worked, and when he spoke his voice was rough. "Go inside. It's cold." He turned and walked toward the house, and Emily followed. Maggie brought up the rear, her mind spinning with questions. What had happened to Mrs. Henderson? Why was Emily so desperate for reassurance, and why did speaking of the child cause Samuel such obvious pain? Inside the sod house was exactly as primitive as she had feared. One room no more than 20 feet square. A cast-iron stove sat in one corner, radiating dying heat. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs occupied the center. In the far corner was a bed covered in animal furs. Against the opposite wall was a smaller cot curtained off with a piece of canvas to provide Emily some privacy. The floor was packed earth swept clean, but still dirt. The walls were lined with old newspapers to keep the earth from crumbling. And yet, as Maggie's seamstress eye took in the details, things did not add up. The chairs were mahogany old and scratched, but clearly quality furniture. The kind of chairs that belonged in wealthy homes, not dirt floor hovels. On a shelf above the bed sat a row of leather-bound books. She moved closer and read the spines. The Wealth of Nations, by Adam Smith. Principles of Geology, by Charles Lyell. Meditations, by Marcus Aurelius. Shakespeare's Sonnets. These were not the books of an uneducated homesteader. She pulled down the Shakespeare volume. It fell open to a marked page, and in the margins someone had written notes in a sharp, angular hand. The ink was high quality, the kind that did not fade. "You like to read." Maggie jumped, nearly dropping the book. Samuel had entered silently. He had removed his duster and hat. Without the shadows, he looked younger than she had initially thought. Perhaps 33 or 34, and despite the beard and the dirt, he was handsome in a rugged, dangerous way. "Yes," she managed. I didn't expect to find a library here. Books are easy to carry. They don't eat much. He moved to the stove and poured himself coffee from a tin pot. He leaned against the wall, watching her over the rim of the cup. You're disappointed. It was not a question. Maggie straightened her spine. If they were going to be honest, then they might as well start now. I'm surprised, Mr. Blackwell. You live in poverty, yet you read philosophy and sit on mahogany chairs, and that lock on your door could stop an army. Who are you hiding from? Or should I ask, who is hiding from you? Samuel set the cup down with a sharp clink. He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. The air in the small room seemed to compress. There are wolves in these hills, Margaret, and things worse than wolves. You wanted protection from debt collectors in Boston. I'm giving it to you. But the price is that you don't ask questions about things that don't concern you. Do we have an agreement? Maggie looked up at him. She saw the danger in him, yes, but she also saw weariness, and beneath the hard exterior she saw fear. And she noticed something else. Around his neck, on a chain tucked beneath his shirt, hung a ring. Gold glinted in the lamplight. The band was thick, heavy, a woman's wedding ring. An agreement, she said quietly. But I need to know one thing. Emily, is she in danger? Samuel's expression shifted. The hardness cracked just for a moment, and she saw raw emotion beneath. Yes, that's why I need a wife. To keep her safe. Then I'll stay. He studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she meant it. Finally he nodded. Take the bed. I'll sleep in the barn tonight. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do. I didn't bring you here to dishonor you. Circuit preacher comes through in 2 weeks. We'll marry proper then. Until that time, you take the bed. He turned toward the door, picking up his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. Samuel. He paused, hand on the latch. Maggie pointed at the Shakespeare book still in her hands. The name on the inside cover, property of C. Ashford. It's been crossed out. Who is Mr. Ashford? Samuel's face went cold, a mask of stone. His knuckles turned white where they gripped the rifle. Clayton Ashford is the man who thinks he owns this valley. He's the man who believes he's owed everything I have, and if he discovers you're here, God help us both. He pulled open the door and stepped out into the night, closing it firmly behind him. The heavy bolt slid into place with a solid thunk. Maggie stood in the silence, Emily's soft breathing from behind the canvas curtain, the only sound. She looked down at the book in her hands, then at the expensive furniture, then at the fortress bolt on the door. She was not just a poor farmer's wife. She was a piece in a game she did not understand. And somewhere out there in the darkness was a man named Clayton Ashford, a man who Samuel feared enough to live like a beggar rather than reveal his true circumstances. Maggie lay down on the furs covering the bed. They smelled of earth and sage and something wild. She pulled the blanket Samuel had given her around her shoulders and stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. She had thought she was running toward safety. Now she realized she had run straight into the center of a war. Morning came with brutal efficiency. Dawn light stabbed through cracks in the wooden door, illuminating dust motes that danced in the cold air. Maggie woke stiff and disoriented, her body aching from the unfamiliar mattress. For a moment she thought she was back in Boston. Then she smelled the earth, the dry scent of packed dirt that formed the floor, and remembered where she was. The sod house was empty. Emily's cot behind the canvas curtain was vacant, the blankets folded neatly. Samuel was gone as well. A note weighted down by a heavy brass compass sat on the table. Gone to check fence line. Stay with Emily. Water barrel is outside. Do not leave the valley bowl. Check the fence line, like a soldier checking a perimeter. Maggie folded the note and looked at the compass. It was expensive, the kind of instrument a professional surveyor would carry. Another piece that did not fit the image of a destitute homesteader. She found Emily outside feeding the scarred roan horse from a bucket of grain. The child turned when Maggie approached, and her expression was guarded. Uncle Samuel said you'd probably sleep late. City people do. I suppose I'm not used to waking with the sun, Maggie admitted. What else did your uncle say? Emily shrugged her thin shoulders, moving beneath her patched dress. That you're going to be his wife. That means you'll be my aunt, sort of. Would you like that?" The question hung in the air. Emily's face worked through several emotions before settling on a careful neutrality. "Mrs. Henderson said she'd be my aunt, too. She left after 3 weeks." "What happened?" Emily threw another handful of grain to the horse. Her voice was very small. "Mr. Ashford came. He yelled at Uncle Samuel, called him a thief and a liar. Mrs. Henderson heard it all. That night she packed her things. Uncle gave her money for the stagecoach. She didn't even say goodbye to me." Maggie felt something tight and painful in her chest. This child had been abandoned before, and now she was bracing herself to be abandoned again. "I'm not Mrs. Henderson," Maggie said firmly. "I don't run from fights." Emily looked up at her hope, warring with fear in her young eyes. "Promise?" "I promise." The child nodded, not quite trusting, but wanting to. She went back to feeding the horse. Maggie stood there for a moment watching the valley. In daylight, it was stark but beautiful. The granite cliffs rose like jagged teeth, and the grass was golden in the morning sun. It was isolated, completely cut off from the outside world. A fortress or a prison, depending on your perspective. Her eyes drifted to the barn. In the harsh light of day, it looked even more decrepit than it had the night before. The structure leaned heavily to one side, as if a strong wind might topple it. The roof was a patchwork of tin and rotting wood. It looked like it might collapse at any moment. But Samuel had spent the night there, and yesterday, when they had arrived, she had noticed something odd. The dimensions of the barn viewed from outside did not match what she had glimpsed through the open door. The exterior suggested a depth of perhaps 30 feet, but when she had looked inside as Samuel retrieved his rifle, the back wall of hay bales appeared to be only 20 feet from the entrance. 10 feet missing. An architectural error, perhaps. Or something else. Curiosity warred with caution. Samuel had warned her not to ask questions, but he was gone checking fence lines that she suspected had nothing to do with farming and everything to do with security. And she needed to understand what she had walked into, for Emily's sake if not her own. Maggie walked to the barn. The door hung on one rusted hinge, secured only by a loop of rope. She called out softly, "Hello, Mr. Blackwell." Silence. She pulled the rope loose and squeezed through the gap. Inside the barn was dim, lit only by shafts of light that pierced through gaps in the rotting siding. At first glance it was exactly what she expected. A rusted plow leaned against one wall. Broken harnesses hung from nails. A pile of moldy hay sat in one corner, and the air smelled of decay and old wood. But Maggie had spent her entire adult life as a seamstress, and her entire life was built on noticing details. A missed stitch, a hem that hung wrong, a button that did not quite match. And something about this barn was wrong. She walked toward the back wall. The hay bales were stacked neatly, too neatly for a structure that otherwise showed signs of neglect. She reached out and pulled at one bale. It was heavy, but shifted easily, as if it had been moved many times before. Behind the hay was not the wooden wall she expected. Instead, there was a canvas tarp, dark and oiled. She pulled it aside, her heart beginning to race. There was a door, not a barn door, a vault door, the kind she had seen on banks in Boston. Heavy steel painted black to blend into the shadows, with a massive iron wheel in the center for opening it. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal this door and to ensure that whatever lay beyond it stayed secure. Maggie stared at it, her mind spinning. What was Samuel hiding in a vault in a rotting barn in the middle of nowhere? She tried the wheel. It was locked tight, unyielding. But when she looked down, she saw something else. The dirt floor near the door was different. She knelt and brushed away the loose earth with her hand. Beneath the dirt was wood carefully disguised but unmistakable. A trap door. This one was not locked. It had a simple iron ring set into the wood. Maggie gripped the ring with both hands and heaved. The trapdoor was heavy, counterweighted, and it swung open with a smooth hiss that spoke of well-oiled hydraulics. The sound was utterly out of place in this primitive setting. Below, a ladder descended into darkness, but not total darkness. A faint glow emanated from below, chemical and steady. Not firelight, lamplight. Maggie knew she should stop. She should close the trapdoor, replace the hay bales, and walk back to the house. Samuel had warned her not to ask questions, but she had a 9-year-old child looking to her for protection, and she could not protect anyone if she did not understand the truth of this place. She gathered her skirts and began to climb down. The air changed as she descended. It became cooler, drier, with the smell of paper oil and something else, something almost electrical. Her feet touched solid ground, and she turned around. She gasped. She was not in a cellar. She was in an office, a command center. The room had been excavated deep into the earth, the walls reinforced with brick and timber. Several kerosene lamps burned low along the walls, providing steady amber light, and the room was filled with equipment, furniture, and documents that had no business being in a homesteader's barn. In the center of the room stood a massive drafting table, the kind professional engineers used. It was covered in maps, not rough sketches, but professional topographical surveys of the entire territory. They were pinned down and covered in complex mathematical calculations, written in that same sharp, angular handwriting she had seen in the Shakespeare book. Along the walls were shelves, but they held no food or supplies. Instead, they were lined with geological samples, rocks in labeled boxes, quartz, pyrite, hematite, each one tagged with a white label bearing location coordinates and mineral composition. And in the corner, sitting on a sturdy desk, was a telegraph machine. A wire ran from it up through the ceiling, disappearing into the earth above. This was not an abandoned piece of equipment. This was active, functional, connected to the outside world. Maggie walked to the drafting table in a daze. The largest map showed Ironstone Valley and the surrounding county. It had been color-coded. Most of the land was marked in red with neat lettering that read, "Property of C. Ashford." The red covered everything, vast swaths of territory that stretched for miles in every direction. But cutting through the center of that red empire was a thin blue line. It started right here at Samuel's homestead and snaked down through the valley into the flatlands below. The legend at the bottom of the map identified it. Blackwater Aquifer, primary access point. Deed holder. Samuel Blackwell, filed March 1871. Maggie stared at the map, her mind racing to catch up with what she was seeing. Water rights. In Wyoming Territory, in any territory in the West, water was more valuable than gold. Whoever controlled the water controlled everything. And if Samuel owned the source of this aquifer, if he held legal deed to the primary access point, then he did not own a worthless patch of dirt. He owned the throat of the entire valley. She moved to the desk. There were ledgers stacked there, leather-bound and well-maintained. She opened the top one. It was not a farmer's accounting of crops and livestock. It was a record of offers, negotiations, threats. May 12, 1874. Ashford offers $5,000. Declined. August 4, 1874. Ashford offers $10,000 plus partnership terms. Declined. September 15, 1874. Barn fire, north corner. Warning shot fired at roof. No casualties reported. January 20, 1875. Ashford offers $50,000. Declined. March 3, 1875. Ashford files custody petition for Emily Ashford Blackwell. Claim unsuitable living environment for minor child. Maggie's blood went cold. $50,000. She had almost sold herself into an arranged marriage to escape a $2,000 debt, and Samuel had turned down a fortune that could build a palace. And the custody petition. Emily. This was not just about land and water rights. This was about the child. I told you not to ask questions. The voice came from the top of the ladder. Maggie spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Samuel was standing at the entrance to the bunker, his silhouette blocking the light from above. He held his rifle loosely in one hand, not aimed at her, but present. His face was in shadow, his expression unreadable. He began to climb down the ladder slowly. His boots made soft thuds on the wooden rungs. When he reached the bottom, he walked past her without a word, took the ledger from her hands and closed it gently. "You're not a farmer," Maggie whispered. Her voice shook not with fear, but with the shock of understanding. "You're wealthy. You could buy this entire valley 10 times over." Samuel let out a bitter laugh, a sound without humor. He set the ledger down and walked to the map. "I'm a man with a piece of paper that says I'm rich and a gun to my head that says I'm dead if I try to cash it in." He gestured at the map at the thin blue line cutting through Ashford's red empire. "I was a surveyor for Union Pacific. 5 years ago, my partner and I were contracted to map routes from Cheyenne to Montana. I found this aquifer. I found it, I documented it, and I filed the deed before Clayton Ashford knew it existed." His finger traced the blue line. "Clayton bought all the land around me, thousands of acres. He thought he could squeeze me out, thought the water had to be on his land somewhere. When he discovered the source was here on my 200 acres, he realized his mistake." Samuel turned to face her, and in the lamplight she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. This was a man who had been fighting a war for years alone and outmatched. "Clayton Ashford controls this town. He controls the law. He controls the bank. If I sell to him, he dams the aquifer and charges the farmers in the valley 10 times what water is worth. He bleeds them dry and takes their land when they can't pay. He turns this territory into his personal kingdom." "So you live like this," Maggie said, realization washing over her. "You hide your wealth. You pretend to be destitute." "To survive," Samuel corrected. "If I show money, I become a target. Every claim jumper, every outlaw, every desperate man for 200 miles would come after me, and Ashford would use it as proof that I'm withholding resources, that I'm an obstacle to progress. He'd find a legal way to take the land." He stepped closer to her, and his voice dropped lower. "I needed a wife, Margaret, because under the Homestead Act, a married man with dependents can file for an extension claim. It doubles the acreage I can legally hold. It makes it harder for Ashford to challenge the deed, and more importantly, it gives me legal standing in Emily's custody case." Maggie felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Everything made sense now. The marriage proposal, the emphasis on discretion, the fortress mentality of this homestead. "I'm a legal maneuver," she said flatly. Samuel's expression softened. He reached out as if to touch her face, then let his hand drop to his side. "You're a partner. I didn't expect you to be intelligent. I didn't expect you to be brave enough to come down here and look for answers. And I certainly didn't expect to feel guilty about bringing you into this war." He sighed deeply. "Get your coat. We need supplies from town. And if we're going to survive this, you need to see the enemy." Maggie stared at him. "You want to go into Ironstone Town, into Ashford's territory. You need to understand what we're facing. And he needs to see that I have a wife now, that my household is stable, that his custody claim is groundless." "What about Emily?" "She stays here. Eleanor Higgins will send her son to watch the homestead. The boy's simple but loyal. Emily knows to hide in the bunker if anyone comes." Maggie thought of the small girl, the fear in her eyes, the desperate hope for someone who would not abandon her. "Tell me the truth. All of it. Not just about the aquifer and the land. Tell me about Emily. Tell me why Clayton Ashford wants custody of her." Samuel's face went very still. For a long moment he did not speak. Then he reached beneath his shirt and pulled out the chain she had glimpsed the night before. Hanging from it was a heavy gold ring, a woman's wedding band. He held it in his palm, staring at it as if it could give him answers. "This ring belonged to my sister, Caroline. She was 19 when she married Clayton Ashford. I tried to stop her. I told her he was dangerous, that the man I had known in the war was gone, replaced by something darker. But she loved him, or thought she did." He closed his fist around the ring. "Emily was born in 1866, 3 years before Caroline and Clayton married." The words hung in the air. Maggie understood immediately. Her breath caught. "Emily is your daughter." "I didn't know," Samuel said, and his voice cracked. "Not until Caroline died. Not until I found the letter she left for me. She wrote it the morning she fled, the morning she took Emily and tried to escape on that stagecoach." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, yellowed and creased from being read too many times. He handed it to Maggie. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was feminine, rushed the letters shaking, as if written in fear or haste. "Samuel, By the time you read this, I will be gone. I cannot live this lie anymore. Clayton knows Emily is not his. He has known for months. He watches her, compares her eyes to yours, her stubbornness to yours. He hates her. He hates me. I am taking Emily and running. East, maybe California. I will send word when it is safe. Forgive me for marrying him. I thought I could forget you. I could not. And Emily deserves to know her real father. Forever yours, Caroline. Maggie lowered the letter, tears blurring her vision. She looked at Samuel and saw that he was crying, two silent tears tracking through the dust on his face. "The stagecoach accident," she whispered, "was not an accident. The driver survived long enough to tell me the horses were spooked by gunfire. There were no bandits, no robbery, just gunfire from the ridge above the pass. The driver disappeared before he could testify. The sheriff ruled it an accident, and I became the primary suspect, the jealous brother who wanted his sister's inheritance." He wiped his eyes roughly. "I took Emily from the orphanage where they had placed her. I brought her here. I have lived like a beggar for 3 years, hiding in this dirt hovel, pretending to be nothing, because it is the only way to keep her safe. Clayton knows she is my daughter. That is why he wants custody, not to raise her, to destroy me." The full picture came together in Maggie's mind. The custody battle was not about Emily's welfare, it was about revenge, about taking from Samuel the one thing he loved more than his own life. And if Maggie had not come, if Samuel had remained a bachelor living in squalor, a judge would have ruled in favor of the wealthy, respectable widower over the hermit uncle. "What do we do?" she asked. Samuel looked at her with something like wonder in his eyes. "You are still willing to stay, after knowing all of this?" Maggie thought of Emily's face, the desperate hope and fear mixed together. She thought of her own father dying slowly while creditors circled. She thought of running through Boston in the rain and the hollow feeling of having nowhere to go and no one to turn to. "I promised a child I would not leave," she said firmly. "And I do not break promises. We face this together, you, me, and Emily." For the first time since she had met him, Samuel smiled. It was small, tentative, but genuine. "Then tomorrow we go to town, and you meet Clayton Ashford." The morning they prepared to leave for town, Samuel transformed before Maggie's eyes. It was subtle, but once she knew what to look for, the change was unmistakable. He hunched his shoulders, making his tall frame appear smaller, defeated. He roughened his accent, letting his words drawl and stumble in ways they had not the day before. He became in every visible way the broken homesteader that Clayton Ashford expected to see. "We have to look beaten," he told Maggie as she changed into her oldest dress, the one she had worn on the train. "Ashford feeds on weakness. If we look proud, he strikes immediately. If we look desperate, he waits, believing time is on his side." He rubbed dirt onto the hem of her skirt, smudged it across the fabric in a way that looked natural, the result of hard living rather than deliberate staging. Then he took a step back and studied her with a critical eye. "That's better. You look like a woman who made a mistake coming west. That's what he needs to believe." Maggie understood the strategy, but something in her rebelled against it. She had spent her life in Boston trying to appear respectable, trying to maintain dignity in the face of poverty and loss. Now Samuel was asking her to embrace the appearance of defeat. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "Pretending to be someone you're not." 3 years, since Caroline died and I took Emily." He checked his rifle, a habitual gesture she had noticed he performed constantly. "Every trip to town, every interaction, I play the role. The hermit who's too stubborn to leave his worthless land. The fool who doesn't understand he's already lost." "But you haven't lost. Not yet." His eyes met hers, and the intensity there sent a shiver through her. "But this is the most dangerous game I've ever played, Margaret. One slip, one moment where the mask falls and we're done. Emily is done." From inside the house they could hear Emily singing softly to herself. A child's song, innocent and sweet, completely unaware of the war being waged for her future. Samuel pulled a small pistol from a hidden pocket in his coat. A Derringer, 2 shots small enough to conceal in a woman's hand. He held it out to Maggie. "Last resort. If something happens, if we get separated, you use this. 2 shots. Make them count." Maggie took the weapon. It was heavier than she expected, cold metal against her palm. She had never held a gun before, though she had seen plenty in Boston. The criminal element that ran the docks always went armed. "I don't know how to shoot." "Point at center mass. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull. The recoil will surprise you, so brace for it." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were teaching her to knead bread. "But you won't need it. Stay close to me. Keep your head down. Don't speak unless spoken to. And whatever you do, don't look Clayton Ashford in the eye." "Why not?" "Because you're too damn brave and he'll see it. He'll see the fight in you, and that makes you dangerous. Right now he thinks you're just a desperate woman who made a bad choice. Let him keep thinking that." They climbed onto the wagon. Emily stood in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the dark interior of the sod house. Her face was pale, her hands gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles were white. "You're coming back, aren't you?" Her voice was small, frightened. Samuel's mask slipped for just a moment. The hardness left his face replaced by something tender and protective. "I promise, little one. We'll be back before dark." "What if Mr. Ashford tries to hurt you?" "He won't. Not in town, not in front of witnesses. He's too smart for that." Samuel's voice was gentle but firm. "You stay inside. Don't answer the door for anyone except Mrs. Higgins' boy when he comes to check on you. Remember the rules." Emily nodded, reciting them like a catechism. "If anyone comes, hide in the bunker. Lock the hatch from inside. Don't come out until Uncle Samuel or Maggie knocks the special pattern." "Good girl." He flicked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. As they rolled away, Maggie looked back and saw Emily standing alone in the doorway watching them go. The image burned itself into her memory. A child learning to be afraid. A child learning that the people she loved might not come back. The journey to Ironstone Town took 2 hours. For most of that time they rode in silence. The landscape around them was harsh but beautiful in its own way. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with snow. The grass had turned golden with the approach of winter, and the sky was a blue so deep it seemed almost painful to look at. Samuel's posture remained hunched, his eyes scanning the horizon constantly. Soldier habits, Maggie realized. Always watching for threats, always calculating distances and escape routes. She wondered what war he had fought and what battles he had survived to leave him this way. As they approached the town, the first signs of civilization appeared. A ranch house here, a smaller homestead there. People working in fields stopped to watch them pass. Some waved, others simply stared. Maggie felt the weight of their gazes, felt them assessing the newcomer, judging, speculating. Ironstone Town sprawled before them, larger than she had expected for such a remote location. The main street formed a cross with a smaller avenue dividing the settlement into distinct sections. To the west she could see the rough timber buildings and canvas tents of the mining camp. Men with dirt-stained clothes and hard faces moved between saloons and supply stores. To the east the buildings were painted white, respectable, with glass windows and wooden sidewalks. And dominating the center of town, sitting on a raised stone foundation like a throne overlooking subjects, was the Ashford Hotel. 3 stories tall, with a wraparound porch and windows that must have cost a fortune to transport from the east. It was beautiful, ostentatious, and completely out of place in this frontier town. It was a statement, Maggie realized, a declaration that Clayton Ashford had money power and the will to display both. As Samuel guided the wagon onto Main Street, the normal sounds of the town seemed to diminish. Conversations died. People turned to watch. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Fear, Maggie thought, or perhaps pity. These people knew Samuel. They knew his situation, and they were watching to see what would happen next. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a general store. The sign above the door read, "Higgins's General Goods," in faded paint. Through the window, Maggie could see shelves stocked with supplies, barrels of flour and beans, tools hanging from hooks on the walls. "Head down," Samuel reminded her quietly. "Remember, you're just a poor woman who made a mistake." They climbed down from the wagon and entered the store. The interior smelled of coffee beans, leather, and sawdust. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 50s, stout and sturdy, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was lined with years of hard living, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She looked up as they entered, and her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Blackwell." Her voice was cool, carefully neutral. "We weren't expecting you until next month." Samuel's posture remained hunched, his voice taking on that rough, uneducated quality Maggie had noticed earlier. "Ran short on flour, Mrs. Higgins, and I brought the wife. Figured she could use some proper supplies." Eleanor Higgins's eyes moved to Maggie, studying her with an intensity that felt like being measured for a dress. Every detail catalogued, every flaw noted. "Mail order, I heard. From Boston." It was not a question. News traveled fast in small towns, even faster when the news involved Samuel Blackwell. Maggie kept her eyes down, playing the role Samuel had outlined for her. "Yes, ma'am." "Well." Mrs. Higgins sniffed a sound that conveyed judgment without words. "I suppose you'll learn soon enough what you've gotten yourself into." They moved through the store selecting supplies: flour, beans, coffee, a few other staples. Samuel moved slowly, deliberately, examining each item as if the few pennies they cost were a fortune he could barely afford. Mrs. Higgins watched them with that same careful neutrality, but as Maggie reached for a bag of dried apples, the older woman moved close, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Smart girl, walking into a lion's den. He's here." Maggie's hand froze on the bag. "Who?" "Ashford, at his hotel. Knows Samuel's in town. He'll come." Mrs. Higgins turned away, her voice rising to normal volume. "That'll be $3.50. Samuel counted out coins, carefully making a show of how difficult it was to part with the money. As he did so, Eleanor slipped a small package wrapped in brown paper into Maggie's basket. Extra ammunition, Maggie realized, hidden beneath the flour sack. She met the older woman's eyes briefly and saw something unexpected there. Not hostility, sympathy, perhaps even alliance. The bell above the door chimed. The temperature in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. Every conversation stopped. Every movement ceased. Maggie felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, some primitive part of her brain recognizing danger before her conscious mind could process it. She turned slowly. A man stood in the doorway. He was perhaps 52, with silver hair slicked back from a high forehead. He wore a gray suit that was immaculate expensive, the kind of clothing that belonged in San Francisco or Denver, not a frontier town. He held a silver-tipped cane, though he walked without any sign of a limp. His face was handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, and when he smiled it did not reach his eyes. Flanked behind him were two men. The one on the left was older. His face scarred a mean set to his jaw that spoke of violence barely restrained. The younger one on the right had eager eyes, the look of a dog waiting for the command to attack. This was Clayton Ashford. Even without being told, Maggie would have known. Power radiated from him like heat from a stove, and with it came something darker. A sense of ownership, of entitlement, of a man who had decided the world owed him everything and would take it by force if necessary. He surveyed the store like a king inspecting his domain. His eyes touched on Samuel, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Well, well, if it isn't the hermit of the hills descended from his cave." His voice was smooth, cultured, educated. The voice of a man who could quote Shakespeare and order a murder in the same breath. He walked toward them slowly, his cane tapping on the wooden floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Tap, tap, tap. And this must be the mail-order bride everyone's been talking about. How quaint. He stopped directly in front of Maggie, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. His eyes moved over her features, cataloging, assessing, seeing far too much. "Let me guess. Boston, educated, running from something, debt perhaps, or scandal?" Maggie kept her eyes down, her heart hammering in her chest. Samuel had warned her. Don't look him in the eye, don't speak. Don't give him anything to use against you. But every instinct screamed at her to meet his gaze, to challenge him, to show him she was not afraid. Samuel stepped between them, his voice taking on that rough, subservient quality that must have cost him dearly to maintain. "We don't want no trouble, Mr. Ashford. Just getting supplies." Clayton laughed, a cold barking sound that held no humor. "Trouble, Samuel, you are the trouble. You're a tick on the back of a thoroughbred, a stain on the progress of this valley." He moved around Samuel with casual arrogance, dismissing him as if he were furniture. His attention returned to Maggie, and something in his expression shifted. Interest, perhaps, or calculation. "You're a pretty thing. I imagine you thought you were getting something better when you answered Samuel's advertisement. A home, perhaps. Security. Instead you get a dirt hovel and a man who plays at being a farmer." Maggie's hands clenched at her sides. The Derringer was in her coat pocket. 2 shots. She could end this right here, right now. But Samuel's words echoed in her mind. This is what he wants, to provoke you, to make you act, to give him an excuse. Clayton stepped closer, invading her space. She could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying. His voice dropped lower, intimate, as if they were alone. "When you grow tired of starving in that hole, Mrs. Blackwell, you come see me. I have a suite at the hotel, hot water for bathing, silk sheets, civilized company. A woman like you deserves better than dirt and desperation." Samuel moved. It was subtle, just a tensing of his shoulders, a shift of weight. But the 2 gunmen behind Ashford responded instantly. Their hands dropped to their holsters, fingers resting on the grips of their pistols. The message was clear. One wrong move and this would end in blood. Maggie saw it all in a flash of understanding. This was the trap. Ashford would provoke Samuel, push him until he snapped. The gunman would shoot him, claim self-defense, and by tomorrow Clayton Ashford would have filed papers to take custody of Emily. Legal, clean, final. She made her choice. Stepping away from Clayton's invasive proximity, she raised her head and met his eyes. Her voice when she spoke was clear and carried the crisp accent of her Boston education. "I prefer the dirt, Mr. Ashford. At least it's honest about what it is." The store erupted in a collective gasp. No one spoke to Clayton Ashford that way. No one challenged him, especially not a woman, especially not a newcomer who had been in town for all of 5 minutes. Clayton's face went very still. For a heartbeat she saw genuine anger flash in his eyes, cold and murderous. Then he smiled, and somehow that was worse. "Spirit, how refreshing. You'll learn, Mrs. Blackwell. This valley has a way of breaking the spirited ones. Just ask your husband's sister. Oh, wait. You can't. She's dead." Samuel made a sound something between a growl and a gasp. His hand moved toward his belt where a knife was sheathed. The gunman tensed. Clayton turned his attention back to Samuel, and his voice took on a harder edge. "Tick-tock, Samuel. The railroad board votes in 90 days. I want that aquifer deed before then. I've been patient, I've been generous with my offers, but my patience has limits. And when those limits are reached, I take what I'm owed." He stepped closer to Samuel, close enough that Maggie could see the tendons standing out in Samuel's neck, could see the effort it took for him not to strike. "And while we're on the subject of what's owed to me, let's discuss Emily. That child living in squalor up on your ridge. No proper schooling, no female guidance. The territorial judge is a reasonable man. He'll see that a widower with means and a proper home has a stronger claim than a bachelor hermit. Even if you've married this unfortunate woman, your living conditions are unsuitable for a child." Samuel's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, but there was murder in it. "You don't care about Emily. You want to hurt me." "Hurt you?" Clayton's smile was sharp as a blade. "Samuel, I want to save that child from you. You couldn't save Caroline. Why should Emily suffer the same fate?" The words hung in the air like poison. Maggie saw Samuel's hands ball into fists, saw the violence radiating from him barely contained. One punch, that's all it would take. One moment of losing control and the gunmen would have their excuse. She acted without thinking. Stepping forward, she placed herself between Samuel and Clayton, her back to the threat facing Samuel directly. "We should go," she said quietly. "Emily is waiting." It broke the spell. Samuel's eyes focused on her, on the reminder of what mattered. Not revenge, not pride. Emily, the child who needed them alive, not dead on the floor of a general store. Clayton chuckled behind her. Well trained already. You've found yourself quite the asset, Samuel. A woman with sense and beauty. I might have to reconsider my offer. Perhaps the deed and the woman. A package deal. Maggie felt Samuel's rage spike again, but before he could respond, she spoke over her shoulder, her voice cold and steady. I'm not property, Mr. Ashford, and I'm not available for any deal you might imagine. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a home to return to. She took Samuel's arm, felt the tension vibrating through him, and guided him toward the counter. Mrs. Higgins had already bagged their supplies, her face pale, but her movements efficient. Samuel threw a gold eagle on the counter, a $20 piece, far more than the supplies cost. Mrs. Higgins stared at the coin, then at Samuel. Her eyes narrowed with understanding. A man in poverty would not have gold, would not spend it so carelessly, would not risk revealing that he had more than he should. Keep the change, Samuel growled. They grabbed the supplies and moved toward the door. Clayton and his men stepped aside, allowing them to pass. As Maggie walked by, Clayton's voice followed her, soft and full of dark promise. We'll speak again, Mrs. Blackwell. Soon. They loaded the supplies into the wagon in silence. Samuel's hands were shaking as he gathered the reins. His face was pale beneath the dirt and beard, his breathing shallow and rapid. Maggie climbed up beside him, and the moment she was seated, he snapped the reins hard. The horse leaped forward, and the wagon careened out of town at a speed that bordered on reckless. They were a mile out of Ironstone before Samuel pulled the wagon off the main trail into a grove of cottonwood trees. He stopped the horse, set the brake, and sat there, hands gripping the edge of the seat so hard the knuckles turned white. You shouldn't have said anything, he finally managed. His voice was hoarse. He was baiting me. If I'd hit him, they would have killed me right there. I know, that's why I stopped you. But now he's interested in you. Now you're not just a piece in the game, you're a target. Maggie turned to face him fully. Snow had begun to fall, light flakes that melted as soon as they touched the ground. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Samuel, I was a target the moment I agreed to this. You needed a wife to strengthen your legal position. That automatically made me a threat to Ashford's plans. Whether I spoke or stayed silent doesn't change that. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. You're not like anyone I've ever met. Good, because you need someone unusual to win this war. They sat there in the falling snow for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Then Samuel laughed, a short, surprised sound. When he touched you, when he made that offer, all I could see was red. All I wanted was to break his neck. I know. I saw it. So did he. That's why he did it. Samuel nodded slowly, understanding settling over him like a weight. He's trying to separate us, to make you doubt this arrangement, to make you afraid. Then he failed. Maggie's voice was firm. I'm not afraid of Clayton Ashford. I'm angry, and angry is useful. They returned to the homestead as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and gold. Emily ran out to meet them, relief written all over her small face. She threw herself at Samuel, nearly knocking him off balance, then turned to Maggie with tears streaming down her cheeks. I thought he might have hurt you. I thought you might not come back. Maggie knelt and pulled the child into her arms. We're here, we're safe, and we're not going anywhere. That night, after Emily had been fed and put to bed, after the supplies had been stored and the horse had been tended to, Samuel and Maggie sat in the bunker. He was checking the telegraph machine, a habitual gesture she had noticed he performed every evening. The machine was silent, but Samuel stared at it as if willing it to come to life. Why a telegraph? Maggie asked. Who are you in contact with? Henry Morrison, old friend from the war. He runs a freight line out of Laramie. He keeps me informed about Ashford's movements, about anything that might affect the railroad vote. Can you trust him? With my life. I saved him at Shiloh, took a bullet that was meant for him. He spent the last 8 years trying to find a way to pay that debt. The machine suddenly clattered to life, making Maggie jump. The ticker tape began to spool out, the metallic clicking filling the underground chamber. Samuel leaned forward, his face going pale as he read the message. He tore the tape free and read it again, his lips moving silently. Then he crumpled it in his fist. "What is it?" Maggie asked, though she already knew the answer would not be good. "Walsh. Vincent Walsh, the man you were running from in Boston. He departed the city 4 days ago. Destination Cheyenne." The floor seemed to drop out from under Maggie. 4 days ago. That meant he was here. He had found her, or would find her very soon. And if Walsh was here, if he was looking for her, then Clayton Ashford almost certainly knew about it. "How?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "How did he find me?" "Ashford." Samuel's voice was tight with controlled rage. "He must have sent inquiries east, telegraph offices, passenger manifests. It wouldn't have been hard. A woman traveling alone from Boston to Cheyenne, arriving around the time I placed that advertisement. Ashford is thorough, and now he has another weapon to use against us. He'll pay Walsh to take me, to remove me from the equation. Yes, without you the marriage is invalid. Without the marriage my guardianship claim is weaker, and Walsh gets his bounty. $2,000 from you, probably more from Ashford as a bonus." Maggie's mind raced. 2 threats now. Clayton Ashford from within the territory using legal and social pressure, and Vincent Walsh from without using debt and violence. And she, Samuel, and Emily were trapped between them. "What do we do?" Samuel stood and moved to one of the shelves. He pulled down a wooden box, opened it, and extracted a stack of papers bound with string. He laid them on the drafting table and untied them carefully. "We accelerate the timeline. The railroad board meets monthly. Next session is in 3 days, not 90. If we can present the geological surveys, the aquifer documentation, and the cost analysis to them directly, we can force an early vote." "But you said Ashford has influence with the board." "He does. With one member, the deputy commissioner. But the rest are businessmen. They care about profit. If they see that the southern route through my land saves them $2 million and 3 months of construction time, they'll vote for it. And the moment they vote, Ashford's northern land holdings become worthless. He'll be bankrupt." Maggie studied the maps, the carefully documented surveys, the calculations that represented years of work. "You've been planning this for a long time." "Since Caroline died. Since I realized Ashford would never stop. The only way to beat him is to destroy his financial base. Without money, he has no power. Without power, he's just another man with a grudge. How do we get these documents to Cheyenne? If we leave Emily here, she's vulnerable. If we take her, we're all exposed." Samuel's jaw clenched. It was the central problem, the impossible equation. Protect Emily or win the war. He could not do both simultaneously. A sound from above made them both freeze. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps, heavy boots on wooden planks, multiple sets. Samuel moved with silent efficiency. He extinguished the lanterns, plunging the bunker into darkness. Maggie heard him moving, heard the metallic click of a rifle being cocked. "Stay quiet," he breathed. "Don't move." Above them, voices. Harsh, rough, the accent of men who lived by violence. "Barn's empty. House looks abandoned. Boss said they went to town today. Should be back by now. Maybe they ran. Maybe Blackwell finally got smart. Or maybe they're hiding." Silence. Then, without warning, a crash. The sound of wood splintering. They were breaking down the door of the house. Emily. The thought hit Maggie like a physical blow. Emily was in the house, asleep in her cot behind the canvas curtain. She would wake to men ransacking her home, to violence and terror. Samuel's hand found Maggie's in the darkness. His grip was tight, almost painful. She could feel the tension vibrating through him, the war between the need to protect and the knowledge that revealing themselves meant certain death. More sounds from above. Furniture being overturned, glass breaking. Then a scream, high-pitched, terrified. Emily. Samuel was moving before Maggie could stop him. He threw open the trapdoor, rifle in hand, and climbed the ladder with deadly speed. Maggie followed, her heart in her throat. The barn was full of armed men, 5 of them, maybe 6. They turned as Samuel emerged, weapons raising, but Samuel was already firing. The Winchester cracked once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. 2 men went down, the others scattered, diving for cover behind hay bales and equipment. "Emily!" Samuel roared. "Run!" The child appeared in the barn doorway, her nightgown white in the moonlight, her face streaked with tears. She stood frozen for a heartbeat, then ran toward Samuel. Bullets tore through the air around her, kicking up dirt, splintering wood. Samuel grabbed her and shoved her toward Maggie. "Bunker now!" Maggie caught Emily and pulled her toward the trap door. More gunfire erupted. Samuel was behind them, firing methodically, keeping the attackers pinned down. They reached the ladder and Maggie practically threw Emily down into the darkness, then followed her hands, slipping on the rungs in her haste. Samuel came last, and as he descended, a bullet caught him. Maggie saw him jerk, saw blood bloom dark against his shirt, but he kept moving. He reached the bottom, spun the wheel lock, and sealed them in. Above the sound of boots on wood, voices shouting. Someone found the trap door. Metal scraped against metal as they tried to force the lock. Samuel leaned against the wall, his breath coming in harsh gasps. His left side was dark with blood spreading fast. "How bad?" Maggie asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror coursing through her. "Bad enough." He pressed his hand against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. "But not fatal. Not yet." Emily was crying, her small body shaking with sobs. Maggie pulled her close, sheltering her with her body, trying to shield her from the sight of Samuel's blood. "What do we do?" Maggie asked. "We wait. They can't get through that hatch. It would take dynamite and they don't have any. Eventually they'll give up and leave." But even as he said it, they all heard it. A new sound from above, liquid splashing against wood, the smell of kerosene. And then the crackle of flames. They were burning the barn. Smoke began to filter down through the cracks around the sealed hatch. Thin at first, then thicker. The air in the bunker was still relatively fresh, but that would not last. If the barn burned completely, if the fire consumed everything, they would suffocate down here. Samuel closed his eyes, and for a moment Maggie thought he might pass out from blood loss. But then he opened them again, and they were clear-focused. "The tunnel," he said. "There's a tunnel. I never told you because I hoped we'd never need it. It exits a 1/4 mile downstream, hidden in the creek bed. If they're all focused on the barn, they won't be watching there." He moved to what appeared to be a solid wall pressed on a particular brick, and a section of the wall swung inward. Beyond was darkness and the smell of damp earth. "Take Emily. The tunnel leads straight out. When you emerge, there's a horse tied there, saddled and ready. Ride to Morrison's freight station in Laramie. He'll protect you." "What about you?" "I'll hold them here. Give you time to get away. You're bleeding. You'll die down here." "Maybe, but you and Emily won't." He gripped her shoulders, his eyes intense despite the pain. "Margaret, listen to me. In the safe, the code is Emily's birthday, 3/14/66. There's 20,000 in gold. Take it. Start a new life. Raise Emily. Tell her about her mother. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't keep her safe." Maggie stared at him. This man who had lived in poverty to protect a child who might not even be his biologically. This man who had endured 3 years of isolation and fear, who had given up everything for a little girl's safety, and now he was asking her to leave him to die. "No. Margaret, I said no." Her voice was steel. "I made a promise, to Emily and to you. We face this together, all 3 of us, or none of us." She tore a strip from her skirt and pressed it against his wound. The bleeding had slowed, but not stopped. He needed medical attention, real medicine, not field dressing in a burning bunker. But for now, it would have to do. "The tunnel," she said. "We all go. You can ride. Emily and I will manage the horse together if we have to. But we don't separate. Not now. Not ever." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Then, despite everything, despite the pain and the smoke and the sound of men trying to kill them above, he smiled. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. Good thing you married me then." They moved into the tunnel. Samuel went first, rifle in one hand, pressing the other against his wound. Maggie followed with Emily, the child's small hand gripped tight in hers. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for Samuel's shoulders, and the ceiling was low enough that they had to crouch. The air was thick with the smell of earth and old water. Behind them, the bunker filled with smoke. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, was freedom or death. Maggie could not tell which. But they were together. That would have to be enough. The tunnel stretched on, seeming endless in the blackness. Samuel counted paces under his breath, using the numbers to orient himself. 100 steps, 200. Emily whimpered but did not cry, her small face pressed against Maggie's side. Then finally, Samuel stopped. Above them was another hatch, this one crude, made of planks and leather hinges. He pushed it open slowly, inch by inch, listening for sounds of pursuit or ambush. Cold air rushed in clean and sharp after the smoke of the bunker. Stars were visible through the opening. Samuel climbed out first, rifle ready, scanning the area. Then he reached down and pulled Emily up, then Maggie. They emerged in a grove of willows near the creek bed. The horse was there, just as Samuel had promised, a sturdy mare already saddled. In the distance, perhaps half a mile away, they could see the glow of flames. The barn was fully engulfed, and the sod house was beginning to catch. 3 years of careful planning, years of living in poverty and fear, all of it burning. Samuel boosted Emily onto the horse, then helped Maggie up behind her. He stood there for a moment, one hand on the horse's neck, looking back at the fire. "Everything I built," he said quietly. "Gone. Not everything." Maggie reached down and touched his face, making him look at her. "Emily is here. You're here. That's what matters." He nodded slowly, then climbed up in front of them. The mare shifted under the weight of 3 riders but held steady. Samuel gathered the reins, but before he could signal the horse to move, they heard it. Hoofbeats, many horses moving fast, coming from the direction of town. "More of them," Samuel said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "We can't outrun them, not 3 on 1 horse." They were trapped. Behind them, the burning homestead. Ahead, armed men coming to finish what they had started. And Samuel was wounded, maybe dying, his blood soaking through Maggie's makeshift bandage. This was the end. Maggie felt it with cold certainty. They had fought, they had survived this long, but Clayton Ashford had won. He had always been going to win. He had more men, more money, more power. 3 people against an empire. Then the hoofbeats resolved into shapes. 8 riders moving in formation. But as they drew closer, Maggie saw something that made her heart leap. These were not Ashford's men. These were freight haulers, rough men on sturdy horses, and at their head rode a man with an eye patch and a rifle across his saddle, Henry Morrison. He pulled up beside them, his horse blowing hard from the run. His one good eye took in the situation at a glance. Samuel wounded the women and child on 1 horse, the homestead burning behind them. "Heard the shooting from town," Morrison said. His voice was gravel and whiskey. "Figured you might need help." "You figured right," Samuel managed. His voice was weak, the blood loss catching up with him. Morrison gestured to his men. "Johnson, Collins, secure the perimeter. Rest of you check for survivors in those buildings. Anyone still moving who ain't Blackwell gets tied up for the sheriff." The men dispersed with military efficiency. These were veterans, Maggie realized, men who had fought in the war and came west looking for peace but never quite forgot how to fight. Morrison swung down from his horse and moved to examine Samuel's wound. "Through and through. You'll live, but you need proper doctoring. My camp's 2 hours north. We've got supplies, and I've got a man who pulled bullets during the war. He'll patch you up." Samuel nodded, too exhausted to argue. Morrison helped him down from the mare, supporting his weight as Samuel's legs threatened to give out. "The bunker," Samuel said. "Documents. Maps. They're in the bunker, if the fire hasn't reached it yet." "I'll get them," Morrison assured him. "You just worry about staying conscious." 2 of Morrison's men returned, dragging 3 prisoners. The men who had attacked the homestead, the ones who had survived Samuel's rifle. They were bound and gagged, their faces sullen with defeat. "These 3 are still breathing," one of Morrison's men reported. "Found 2 dead in the barn. The others ran when they saw us coming. Good. Morrison's face was hard. We'll turn these over to the federal marshal in Laramie. Attempted murder, arson, assault. Even if Ashford bought the local sheriff, he can't buy federal law. Maggie looked at the prisoners, at their rough faces and empty eyes. These were hired gunsmen who killed for money and asked no questions. But someone had hired them. Someone had sent them to kill Samuel and take Emily. And that someone was sitting in his hotel in Ironstone Town, probably already planning his next move. One of Morrison's men climbed down from the burning barn, his arms full of leather satchels and rolled maps. He had saved the documents, the precious surveys and calculations that represented Samuel's only real weapon against Clayton Ashford. "Got everything that wasn't nailed down," the man reported. "That bunker is well built. Fire didn't reach it yet, but another hour and the whole structure will collapse." Samuel closed his eyes in relief. The documents were safe. His years of work, his careful planning, it had not all been lost. They still had a chance. Morrison organized his men with practiced efficiency. 2 riders would take the prisoners to Laramie. 2 more would stay behind to watch the homestead to make sure no one returned to search the ruins. The rest would escort Samuel, Maggie, and Emily north to Morrison's freight camp. As they prepared to ride out, Emily tugged on Maggie's sleeve. Her face was pale, her eyes huge in the starlight. "Our house is gone," she whispered. "Where will we live now?" Maggie pulled the child close, holding her tight. She had no answer. Everything they had was burning behind them. All they had left was each other and a leather satchel full of papers that might or might not be enough to save them. "We'll figure it out," she said, trying to sound confident. "Together, we'll find a way." But as they rode north into the darkness, leaving the burning homestead behind them, Maggie wondered if that was true. Clayton Ashford had escalated. He had moved from legal pressure to outright violence. And if he was willing to burn them out to hire men to kill Samuel, what would he do when he discovered they had survived? What would be his next move? The answer came sooner than she expected. As they crested a ridge, Morrison held up his hand, signaling a halt. In the valley below they could see torches. Many torches, at least 20 men on horseback moving toward them. "Ashford's men," Morrison said grimly. "He must have sent them when he heard the shooting. They're hunting you." Samuel straightened in his saddle, his face pale but determined. "Then we run. With you wounded and 3 on a horse, we won't make it. Then we fight." Morrison studied the approaching torches, calculating distances, counting men. His face was grim. "We're outnumbered 3-1, and they have the high ground advantage." Maggie felt Emily trembling against her, felt the child's fear like a physical weight. They had survived the fire, survived the gunmen, and now they were going to die on this ridge in the middle of nowhere because Clayton Ashford wanted revenge and a piece of land. Then Samuel spoke, his voice weak but clear. "Margaret, take Emily. Go with Morrison. I'll lead them away, buy you time." "No. It's the only way." "I said no, and I meant it." Maggie's voice was fierce. "We don't separate. Not now, not ever. I made you a promise. Samuel Blackwell and I keep my promises." Morrison looked between them then at the approaching torches. His face split into a grin that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with the kind of madness that comes from facing impossible odds. "Well then," he said, working the lever on his rifle, "if we're going to make a stand, let's make it a good one." But before the battle could begin, before the first shot could be fired, the sky lit up, not with fire, with dawn. And with the dawn came the sound of a steam whistle, distant but clear, a train whistle. The Union Pacific Line ran 15 miles east of where they stood, a train heading west toward Cheyenne carrying passengers and freight, and most importantly, witnesses. Civilization close enough to reach if they could just buy enough time. Samuel looked at Maggie, and understanding passed between them. The documents, the geological surveys. If they could get those to Cheyenne, to the railroad board, they could end this. Not with violence, but with economics, with proof that the southern route was better, cheaper, faster. "How far to the rail line?" Maggie asked Morrison. 15 miles, maybe 2 hours at a hard ride." "Can we make it?" Morrison looked at the approaching torches, at the wounded man barely staying upright in his saddle, at the woman and child who refused to give up. "We can try." And so they ran, not away from the fight, but toward their only hope of ending it, toward a train that might carry their salvation or their doom. Behind them, Clayton Ashford's men gave chase, their torches bobbing in the darkness like malevolent stars. The race had begun, and everything depended on who reached civilization first. The dawn broke cold and merciless across the Wyoming plains. Samuel Blackwell leaned forward in his saddle, one hand pressed against the wound in his side, the other gripping the reins with failing strength. Behind him, Emily clung to Maggie's waist, her small face buried against the woman's back. Around them, Henry Morrison's men rode in a protective formation, rifles, ready eyes scanning the horizon for pursuers. They had been riding for 3 hours. The horses were exhausted, their breath coming in great clouds of steam in the frozen air. Samuel knew they could not maintain this pace much longer. The mare carrying Maggie and Emily was stumbling, her head drooping with fatigue. His own mount was in little better condition. Morrison pulled alongside him, his one good eye assessing Samuel's condition with the expertise of a man who had seen too many wounded soldiers. "You're fading," Morrison said bluntly. "We need to stop, get that wound properly dressed." "No time. They're still behind us." "They're 2 hours back." "We can spare 20 minutes." Samuel shook his head, though the movement made the world swim dangerously. "Every minute we waste is a minute Ashford has to consolidate his position. We need to reach Cheyenne, get those documents to the railroad board. You won't reach anywhere if you bleed out on this trail." Before Samuel could argue, Emily's voice cut through the discussion, high and frightened. "Uncle Samuel is falling." Samuel felt it happening, felt his grip on consciousness slipping away like sand through his fingers. The world tilted sideways. Strong hands caught him before he hit the ground. Morrison and one of his men eased him down from the horse, supporting his weight. "Make camp," Morrison ordered. "Here in these rocks. We're hidden from the trail. Collins, you're on watch. Johnson, get the medical kit. The rest of you tend the horses." They carried Samuel into a natural shelter formed by 3 massive boulders. Someone spread a blanket, and they laid him down on it. Maggie was there immediately, Emily at her side, both of them pale with fear. Morrison cut away Samuel's shirt, exposing the wound. The bullet had passed through cleanly, but the riding had reopened it, and Samuel had lost more blood than Maggie had realized. The makeshift bandage was soaked through, useless. "Bad," Morrison muttered, "but I've seen worse. Johnson, bring the whiskey and the needle." The man who approached carried a leather satchel that had clearly seen hard use. He opened it to reveal surgical instruments, bottles of carbolic acid and whiskey thread, and needles. His hands were steady as he cleaned the wound with whiskey, ignoring Samuel's sharp intake of breath. "Served as a field surgeon during the war," Morrison explained to Maggie. "Lost more patients than I saved, but the ones who lived generally stayed that way." The suturing took 15 minutes. Samuel bit down on a leather strap to keep from crying out, not wanting to frighten Emily further. The child watched with wide eyes, her small hand gripping Maggie's tightly. When it was done, Johnson wrapped the wound with clean bandages and stepped back. "He needs rest. Real rest, not 20 minutes in a rock shelter. And he needs to eat something, get his strength back." "How long?" Maggie asked. "A week, maybe more." "We don't have a week." Samuel's voice was weak but determined. "The board meeting is tomorrow at noon. If we're not there, if we don't present those surveys, Ashford wins by default." Morrison crouched beside him, his expression serious. "Listen to me, Samuel. You're in no condition to ride. And even if you were, Ashford has men watching the roads into Cheyenne. They'll be looking for you." "Then what do you suggest?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he looked at Maggie, and something shifted in his expression. "She goes. Alone." Maggie felt the words like a physical blow. "What? Think about it. Ashford's men are looking for Samuel. They're looking for a wounded man traveling with a woman and child. They're not looking for a woman traveling alone." Morrison turned to address her directly. "You take the documents. You present them to the board. Samuel's name is on all the surveys, all the calculations. They're notarized. The board will accept them whether he's there in person or not." "I can't," Maggie said. "I don't know anything about geology or engineering. I won't be able to answer their questions." "You don't need to. The documents speak for themselves. All you need to do is put them in front of the board and let the numbers do the talking." Samuel struggled to sit up, his face gray with pain. "It's too dangerous. If Ashford realizes what she's doing, if he catches her alone—" "He won't," Morrison interrupted, "because she won't be going by road. She'll go by river." They all turned to stare at him. The Ironstone River ran roughly parallel to the route they had been following, but it was notoriously treacherous. Rapids, rocks, sudden drops. It was a route no one in their right mind would attempt, especially not in late autumn when the water was high and cold. "You're insane," Samuel said flatly. "I'm practical. Ashford won't be watching the river because he doesn't think anyone would be foolish enough to use it, and the current will carry her downstream faster than any horse could travel. She could be in Cheyenne by tomorrow morning, hours before the board meeting. And if she capsizes, if the boat is destroyed, then she swims, and if she drowns, well, at least Ashford won't get the satisfaction of killing her himself." Maggie felt the weight of their gazes on her. This was her choice. Stay here with Samuel and Emily, safe but helpless, and watch Ashford win, or take the documents, brave the river alone, and give them a chance at victory. It was not really a choice at all. "I'll do it." "Margaret, no." Samuel's voice was sharp despite his weakness. "I won't let you risk your life for this." "You don't get to decide what I risk my life for." Maggie knelt beside him, taking his hand in hers. "You've been fighting this battle alone for 3 years. You've sacrificed everything for Emily, for the valley, for people who don't even know what you've done for them. Let me help. Let me be your partner in this, not just in name, but in truth." Samuel stared at her, and she saw the war being waged behind his eyes. Pride fought with pragmatism. Fear for her safety battled against the desperate need to end this. Finally, he nodded, the gesture costing him dearly. "If you do this, you need to understand what you're walking into. The board will be hostile. Half of them are in Ashford's pocket. The chairman, Marcus Whitfield, is an honest man, but he's outnumbered. You'll need to be strong, convincing. You'll need to make them see the truth even when they don't want to." "I can do that. And if Ashford is there, if he tries to intimidate you, I've already faced Clayton Ashford once. I can do it again." Morrison stood and gestured to one of his men. "Collins, you know the river. Can you guide her through the worst of it?" The man called Collins stepped forward. He was young, perhaps 20, with a weathered face that suggested he had seen more of life than his years warranted. "I've run the Ironstone twice, lost a boat the first time, nearly drowned the second, but yeah, I can guide her." "Good. You leave in an hour. Take the lightest skiff we have and as little gear as possible. Speed is everything." Maggie turned to Emily, who had been silent through all of this, her small face unreadable. The child looked up at her with eyes too old for her years. "You're leaving. Only for a little while, just long enough to end this. What if you don't come back?" It was the same question Emily had asked before, but this time the stakes were real, the danger immediate. Maggie pulled the child close, holding her as tightly as she dared. "I will come back. I promise you, Emily, I will come back, and when I do, we'll be free, all of us. No more running, no more hiding, no more fear." Emily's arms went around her neck, squeezing hard. "I'll wait for you, no matter how long it takes." Samuel reached into his coat with trembling fingers and pulled out a leather pouch. He pressed it into Maggie's hands. "Emergency funds, gold coin. If something goes wrong, if you need to bribe someone or buy passage, use it. Don't hesitate." Then he reached up and removed the chain from around his neck, the one that held Carolyn's gold ring. He placed it in her palm, closing her fingers around it. "This was my sister's. She died trying to escape Ashford, trying to get Emily to safety. You're doing what she couldn't. If anything happens to me, give this to Emily. Tell her that her mother loved her. Tell her that I tried." Maggie's throat was too tight for words. She nodded, slipping the chain into her pocket alongside the derringer Samuel had given her days ago. 2 shots. She prayed she would not need them. Morrison provided her with oilskin wrappings for the documents sealed and waterproof. The leather satchel containing the surveys, the aquifer maps, the cost analyses, all of it was carefully packaged to survive immersion. He also gave her a change of clothes wrapped in more oilskin and a small pack of dried food. "Eat when you can," he advised. "The river will drain your strength faster than you think. And listen to Collins. If he tells you to hold on or to bail water or to jump, you do it immediately. No questions." An hour later, Maggie stood at the edge of the Ironstone River. The water was dark and fast churning with autumn runoff. The skiff that Collins had prepared looked impossibly fragile, a crude wooden shell that seemed more likely to disintegrate than to carry them safely. Samuel had insisted on walking down to see her off despite Johnson's protests. He leaned heavily on Morrison's shoulder, his face pale, but his eyes clear. "The board meets at Union Pacific Headquarters, 3rd floor. Ask for Chairman Whitfield. Tell him you're representing me. Tell him the truth." "I will." "And Margaret." He reached out and touched her face, his fingers gentle despite their roughness. "Come back to us. Please." She wanted to say something profound, something that would capture the strange and fierce emotion that had grown between them over these few days. But there were no words adequate for it, so she simply nodded and climbed into the skiff. Collins took his position at the stern, gripping the rudder. He nodded once to Morrison, then pushed off from the bank. The current caught them immediately, sweeping them downstream with frightening speed. Maggie looked back once and saw Samuel standing there, one hand raised in farewell or benediction. Then the river curved and he was gone from sight. The first hour was manageable. The current was swift but relatively smooth, and Collins navigated the skiff with practiced skill. Maggie bailed water when it sloshed in over the sides, her hands quickly going numb in the frigid water. Then they reached the rapids. The sound hit them first, a deep roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. Collins shouted something, but his words were lost in the noise. He gestured frantically, and Maggie understood. She grabbed the ropes lashed to the sides of the skiff and held on with all her strength. The world became chaos. Water crashed over them from all sides. The skiff bucked and spun, slamming into rocks with impacts that sent shudders through the fragile frame. Maggie's fingers ached from gripping the rope, her arms burning with the effort of holding on. A wave larger than the others crashed over the bow, and suddenly Collins was gone. One moment he was there, fighting the rudder, and the next he was in the water, swept away by the current. Maggie screamed his name, but the river swallowed the sound. She was alone in the skiff, spinning out of control, with no idea how to steer or stop. The oilskin bundle containing the documents was still secured to the bottom of the boat, but for how long? Another rock loomed ahead, massive and jagged. The skiff struck it broadside with a crack like a gunshot. The boat split, water pouring in through the breach. Maggie grabbed the oilskin bundle and jumped, hitting the icy water with a shock that drove the air from her lungs. The current took her. She fought to keep her head above water, to keep the precious documents out of the river. But the Ironstone was merciless. It tumbled her, spun her, dragged her down into darkness, and then thrust her back up into the light. Her hand struck something solid. A boulder smooth with water but stable. She grabbed it with desperate strength, pulling herself partway out of the water. Her legs dangled in the current, trying to pull her back in, but she held on. Downstream she could see the remains of the skiff smashed to splinters against the rocks. Of Collins there was no sign. He was dead, drowned in the river he had tried to help her navigate. Another young life lost to Ashford's greed. Maggie said a silent prayer for him, promising herself that his sacrifice would not be in vain. She would reach Cheyenne. She would win this fight. For Collins. For Samuel. For Emily. Maggie pulled herself fully onto the boulder and lay there gasping, shaking with cold and shock. The oilskin bundle was still clutched to her chest, miraculously intact. She had lost everything else. The change of clothes, the food, the derringer, even the leather pouch of gold coins, all gone. But she had the documents. That was what mattered. The boulder she clung to was one of many in a shallow section of the river. Beyond the rapids, the water calmed, flowing more gently toward the distant goal of Cheyenne. If she could just reach the far bank, if she could find the railroad line, she might still make it in time. She forced herself to move to climb down from the boulder and wade through the shallows to shore. Every step was agony. Her legs barely supported her weight, her muscles cramped from cold and exertion. But she kept moving one step at a time until she collapsed on the muddy bank. How long she lay there she could not say. Minutes or hours. The sun was higher in the sky when she finally forced herself to sit up to take stock of her situation. She was soaked to the skin, freezing alone in the wilderness with no food, no weapon, no money. She had no idea how far she had traveled on the river or how much farther she needed to go. But somewhere to the east was the railroad, and beyond that was Cheyenne and the board meeting that might end this nightmare. Maggie got to her feet and started walking. The sun was setting when she finally heard it. The distant whistle of a train carried on the evening wind. She stumbled toward the sound, her feet bloody and raw inside her ruined boots, her dress torn and caked with mud. The railroad tracks stretched before her, twin lines of steel running east to west. She stood between them and waited. The train was coming. She could feel the vibration through the rails, could hear the growing thunder of its approach. When it appeared around the curve, massive and inexorable, she stepped to the side of the tracks and began to wave her arms. The engineer saw her, this wild-looking woman, standing alone in the gathering darkness, and the train began to slow. It took nearly a quarter mile for the locomotive to come to a complete stop. By the time it did, Maggie had run alongside it, matching its decreasing speed, driven by desperation and sheer will. A conductor appeared on the rear platform of the last passenger car, his face a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Miss, what in God's name are you doing out here?" Maggie climbed onto the platform, her legs nearly giving out. The oilskin bundle was still clutched to her chest, protected through everything. "I need to get to Cheyenne, Union Pacific headquarters. It's urgent." The conductor took in her appearance, the mud and the torn dress and the wild look in her eyes. "Miss, you look like you've been through hell itself. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I need to get to Cheyenne. The board meeting tomorrow. I have documents, evidence. It's life or death." Something in her voice and the intensity of her gaze convinced him. He stepped aside and gestured into the car. "We'll be in Cheyenne in 3 hours. There's a water closet at the end of the car if you want to clean up, and I'll see if we can find you something dry to wear." Maggie stumbled into the passenger car. The other occupants stared at her, this bedraggled woman who looked like she had crawled out of a river. She ignored them all and sank into the nearest seat, finally allowing herself to believe that she might actually make it. The train pulled into Cheyenne just after midnight. Maggie, wearing a borrowed dress that was too large and shoes that pinched, stepped onto the platform and looked around at the sleeping city. She had a few hours before dawn before the board meeting, a few hours to prepare herself for the fight of her life. She found a hotel that would take her despite her appearance, the clerk's suspicion overcome by the desperation in her voice. She paid with a promise that funds would be forthcoming, and the man, seeing something in her that moved him to mercy, gave her a room. Maggie spent the night carefully unpacking the documents, checking each one for water damage. The oilskin had done its job. Every survey, every calculation, every piece of evidence was intact. She laid them out on the bed and studied them by lamplight, memorizing the key points, preparing her arguments. At 8 in the morning, she washed her face in cold water, borrowed a comb to tame her hair, and dressed in the only clothes she had. The borrowed dress was clean, but plain, too large in the shoulders and too long in the hem. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had lost everything and had one desperate chance left to win it back. Union Pacific headquarters was an imposing brick building in the center of Cheyenne. Maggie stood outside it for a moment, gathering her courage, then climbed the steps and entered. A secretary behind a desk looked up as she approached. His expression was professionally neutral, but she could see the judgment in his eyes. This was not the kind of woman who usually had business here. "I need to see Chairman Whitfield. It's about the route selection for the Montana line. The board meeting doesn't begin until noon, miss, and it's a closed session. I'm representing Samuel Blackwell. He holds the deed to the Ironstone Aquifer. The board needs to see his surveys before they vote." The secretary's expression shifted. Samuel Blackwell. We were told he was unavailable, that he'd withdrawn from consideration. You were told wrong. Where is the boardroom? Third floor. But miss, I really can't let you just... Maggie was already walking toward the stairs, her borrowed shoes clicking on the marble floor. The secretary called after her, but she ignored him. She had not survived the river and the wilderness and 3 days of hell to be stopped by a functionary with delusions of authority. The third-floor corridor was lined with doors. She found the one marked boardroom and pushed it open. 12 men sat around a long mahogany table. They looked up in surprise as she entered, this disheveled woman, interrupting their pre-meeting preparations. At the head of the table sat a man in his 60s, distinguished and serious. Chairman Whitfield, she assumed. "Gentlemen," Maggie said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "my name is Margaret Blackwell. My husband owns the water rights to the Ironstone Aquifer, and I have information that will save Union Pacific $2 million and 3 months of construction time." One of the men at the table laughed a dismissive sound. "This is irregular. This meeting is closed to the public." "I'm not the public. I'm a stakeholder in this decision." Chairman Whitfield raised his hand, silencing the other man. "Let her speak. We'll decide if what she has to say is relevant." Maggie moved to the table and began unpacking the oilskin bundle. She spread the surveys across the polished wood, the maps and calculations and geological analyses that Samuel had spent years compiling. The southern route through Ironstone Valley, she began, her voice gaining strength with each word. $2 million cheaper than the northern route. 3 months faster. Unlimited water access for steam locomotives guaranteed by legal deed filed in 1871 and held by Samuel Blackwell. The men leaned forward, studying the documents. Some of them looked skeptical, but others showed genuine interest. "These surveys were prepared by your own employee," Maggie continued. "Samuel Blackwell, contracted surveyor from 1869 to 1872. Everything is notarized. Everything is verified. The cost analysis is conservative. The timeline is achievable." A man at the far end of the table, sleek and well-dressed, spoke up. His voice dripped with false concern. "These could be forged. Where is Mr. Blackwell? Why isn't he here to present this himself?" "He was attacked. 3 nights ago, men burned his homestead and shot him. He's recovering, but he sent me in his place because he knew how important this vote is." The sleek man smiled. "How convenient. And you expect us to take the word of a woman who appears to have been dragged through a river backwards. I expect you to examine the evidence. The documents speak for themselves." Chairman Whitfield picked up one of the surveys, studying it closely. His expression was thoughtful. "These are professional quality, and I recognize Blackwell's work. He was one of our best surveyors." "He still is," Maggie said. "But there's something else you need to know. Something about the man who's been lobbying for the northern route." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the last document. Not a survey, but a copy of Caroline's diary, the pages carefully transcribed and notarized, and with it evidence that Morrison had helped her gather from county records, evidence of embezzlement, of fraud, of murder. "Clayton Ashford has been presenting himself as a respectable businessman, but he's built his empire on stolen money and intimidation. He murdered his wife when she tried to leave him. He's leveraged to criminal lenders. And if you choose the northern route, you'll be in business with a man who will drag Union Pacific into his financial ruin." She laid out the evidence piece by piece. Bank records showing Ashford's debts, testimony from witnesses about Caroline's death, county records that had been mysteriously altered. Morrison's freight company had done the investigative work following leads that Samuel had identified over years of watching and waiting. The boardroom erupted into chaos, men shouting questions, demanding explanations. The sleek man at the end of the table, the one Maggie now understood was Ashford's paid representative, tried to object, to dismiss the evidence as slander and forgery. But Chairman Whitfield silenced them all with a raised hand. His face was grave as he examined the documents. "This is serious. If even half of this is true, we can't partner with Ashford. The financial risk alone is unacceptable." "It's all lies," the deputy commissioner shouted. "This woman is trying to manipulate you with false evidence. Then have your lawyers examine it, Maggie challenged. Check the county records. Talk to the witnesses. Send telegrams to Boston to the banks Ashford owes money to. You'll find that every word is true. Whitfield looked at her for a long moment, and she met his gaze without flinching. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to back down now. We'll call a recess, Whitfield said. 2 hours to verify these claims. If they check out, we reconvene to vote. If they don't, Miss Blackwell, you'll find yourself facing charges for slander and obstruction. I'll be waiting, Maggie said. She was escorted to an anteroom to wait. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Through the window she could see Cheyenne going about its business completely unaware that the fate of an entire valley was being decided in this building. 1 hour passed, then another. Finally a clerk appeared and gestured for her to follow. She walked back into the boardroom on legs that felt like water. The atmosphere had changed. The men around the table looked grim. Ashford's deputy commissioner was pale, his earlier confidence gone. Chairman Whitfield's expression was thunderous. We've verified your claims, he said without preamble. County records confirm the embezzlement. Bank records show Ashford is leveraged beyond reason. And we've received a telegraph from the territorial marshal. Clayton Ashford was arrested this morning on charges of attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. Maggie's heart leaped. Arrested. Samuel must have contacted Morrison, must have arranged for federal marshals to act. They had planned for this contingency, had built a case that could stand even without the board's cooperation. In light of this evidence, Whitfield continued, and in light of the superior cost analysis and geological data provided by Mr. Blackwell, I'm calling for an emergency vote on the Montana line route. All in favor of the southern route through Ironstone Valley. 11 hands rose. Only the deputy commissioner abstained, his face a mask of defeat. Motion carries. The southern route is approved. Mrs. Blackwell, please convey our gratitude to your husband. He saved this company a considerable sum and months of delays. Maggie wanted to cry, to laugh, to shout with relief. Instead, she simply nodded, too overwhelmed for words. There's one more thing, Whitfield said. Union Pacific will pay fair market rate for water access, $500 per month for the duration of the line's operation. And we'd like to contract Mr. Blackwell as a consulting engineer for Western expansion, if he's interested. $500 per month, $6,000 per year. It was more money than Maggie had ever imagined. It was enough to build a real home, to give Emily a proper education, to live without fear or want. I'll tell him, she managed. Thank you. She walked out of the building in a daze, the morning sun bright on her face. They had won. Against impossible odds, against wealth and power and violence, they had won. The aquifer was secure. Ashford was arrested. The valley was safe. But the victory felt hollow without knowing if Samuel was alive to share it, without knowing if Emily was safe. She needed to get back to them, needed to see with her own eyes that they had survived. She found the telegraph office and sent a message to Morrison's freight station. 3 words. We won. Coming. The response came within the hour. Samuel stable. Emily safe. We're waiting. Maggie bought a ticket on the afternoon train heading west. This time she traveled in comfort in a proper passenger car with a window seat. As the train carried her back toward Ironstone Valley, she watched the landscape roll by and thought about everything that had happened. 10 days ago, she had been a terrified woman fleeing Boston with nothing but debts and desperation. Now she was Margaret Blackwell, wife to a man of means, mother figure to a child who needed her, and the woman who had stood before a railroad board and changed the future of the territory. The train pulled into a station 20 miles from Ironstone Valley as the sun was setting. Morrison was waiting with horses and men ready to escort her the rest of the way. His grizzled face broke into a rare smile when he saw her. You did it. I knew you would, but it's good to have confirmation. How is he? Weak, but he'll live. Been asking for you every hour since you left. They rode through the twilight, the mountains rising dark against the star-filled sky. When they crested the final ridge, Maggie could see lights in the valley below. Not from the burned homestead, but from Morrison's freight camp, where Samuel and Emily had been sheltering. She dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and ran toward the largest tent. Inside, by lamplight, Samuel lay on a cot. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear, and when he saw her, relief washed over his features so intensely it was almost painful to witness. "You're alive," he breathed. "Collins didn't make it back. I thought, I'm here, I'm safe." She knelt beside the cot and took his hand. "And we won Samuel. The board voted for the southern route. Ashford is arrested. It's over." He stared at her, and she saw tears forming in his eyes. 3 years of fighting, of fear, of living like a beggar to protect what he loved. And it was finally, truly over. "Emily?" Maggie asked. "Sleeping in the next tent. She wouldn't rest until I promised you were coming back." Maggie squeezed his hand. "I told her I keep my promises." "You do," Samuel said softly. "You keep every one." 6 months passed. The burned homestead was cleared away, the land prepared for new construction. This time they built a proper home. Not a mansion, nothing ostentatious, but a solid timber house with glass windows and wooden floors. The bunker remained repurposed as Samuel's office, where he continued to consult for Union Pacific on Western expansion projects. Emily thrived. With money for a real teacher and proper books, she devoured education like a starving person given a feast. She grew taller, healthier, the haunted look fading from her eyes as she learned that safety could be permanent, that the people she loved would not disappear. Before the trial, Samuel presented the territorial judge with medical documentation he had kept hidden for years. A certificate from Dr. Herbert Cornwall in Cheyenne, dated February 1866, confirming Caroline's pregnancy, and at her request listing Samuel Blackwell as the father. The document destroyed any legal claim Ashford might have had to Emily's custody, even from prison. Clayton Ashford stood trial in the territorial court. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He was convicted of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. The murder of Caroline could not be proven beyond doubt, but it did not matter. He was sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison in the East. His empire collapsed overnight. His lands sold to pay his debts. His hotel turned over to new management. On a warm spring day in 1876, Samuel and Maggie stood on the porch of their new home and watched the first Union Pacific train roll through the valley below. The rails gleamed in the sunlight, carrying commerce and civilization into the wilderness. The water tower built near their property drew from the ironstone aquifer, and every drop that fed the locomotives was money in their accounts. "Do you regret it?" Samuel asked. "Coming west to marry a stranger, nearly dying half a dozen times in the first week?" Maggie laughed. "Ask me that question when I'm old and gray." "You might be waiting a while for that." She turned to him, this man who had learned to trust again, who had fought for what was right even when it cost him everything. The beard was gone now, and she could see the handsome face beneath. But it was not his appearance that had won her heart. It was his integrity, his courage, his absolute dedication to protecting those who could not protect themselves. "I don't regret a single moment," she said. "Not the fear, not the danger, not the cold or the hunger or the river, because all of it led here, to this." Samuel pulled her close, and they stood there watching their daughter, their Emily, play in the yard with a puppy that Morrison had brought as a housewarming gift. The child's laughter carried on the breeze, pure and joyful, the sound of a future that was finally secure. That evening, after Emily had been tucked into bed in her own room with her own books and her own lamp, Samuel and Maggie sat in their parlor. He was reading by firelight, and she was sewing, and the domestic peace of the moment was something neither of them took for granted. A knock at the door interrupted the quiet. Samuel opened it to find a young man in a Union Pacific uniform holding a telegram. "For you, sir. Marked urgent." Samuel tipped the messenger and closed the door. He unfolded the telegram and read it, his expression growing serious. "What is it?" Maggie asked. "Clayton Ashford. He's dead. Killed in prison 3 days ago. Stabbed by another inmate." They were both silent for a moment, processing this information. Maggie felt no joy at the news, but no grief either. Ashford had made his choices, and they had led him to this end. "It's truly over then," she said quietly. "Yes, finally." Samuel folded the telegram and tossed it into the fire. They watched it burn, watched the paper blacken and curl and turn to ash. With it went the last shadow of the past, the final tie to the man who had tried to destroy them. The years that followed were good ones. Samuel's consulting work for Union Pacific kept them comfortable, and the water royalties provided security for Emily's future. The valley prospered, with the railroad new settlements springing up, farms succeeding where once only wilderness had stood. Emily grew into a remarkable young woman. At 18, she enrolled in a women's college in Denver, studying engineering like her father. She fell in love with a railroad engineer, a good man who treated her with respect and kindness. They married when she was 19, and a year later Emily gave birth to her first child, a son they named William. 2 more children followed in quick succession. On a cold evening in December of 1895, 20 years after that desperate flight from Boston, Samuel Blackwell sat in his library with his 7-year-old grandson, William. The boy had been asking about the past, about the old days, about what it took to build something lasting in the wilderness. And so Samuel told him the story. Not a sanitized version, not a tale where heroes were perfect and villains were simple. He told the truth, about fear and courage, about people who made mistakes and people who made sacrifices, about a woman from Boston who kept her promises even when it nearly killed her. When he finished, William was silent for a long moment. "That's a good story, grandfather." "It's a true story. That makes it better." "And great-grandmother Maggie really came back after you thought she might have drowned." "She did. She always kept her word." "Is that what it means to be strong, to keep your promises even when it's hard?" Samuel smiled. "That's part of it, yes. But the real strength is showing up, Thomas, especially when you're scared, especially when the odds are against you. Your great-grandmother taught me that. She showed up every single day, even when she had every reason to run." The door to the library opened, and Maggie entered, older now, but still possessing that fierce intelligence that had first drawn Samuel to her. She carried a tray with hot cider for the 3 of them. "Are you filling the boy's head with war stories again?" she asked, but her tone was affectionate. "Just telling him the truth about how we met." "The truth." Maggie handed William his cup. "The truth is that your grandfather was the bravest man I ever met, and the most stubborn." "I learned from the best," Samuel said. Maggie settled into her chair beside the fire, and the 3 of them sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the wind howl outside. The valley beyond their windows was dark, but it was a friendly darkness full of homes and families and futures that would not have existed without the choices made 20 years ago. William broke the silence with another question. "Do you think I'll ever do something brave like that, grandfather?" Samuel considered the boy, seeing in his young face echoes of Emily and Caroline, seeing the future of a family that had survived against impossible odds. "I think you'll do whatever needs to be done when the time comes. Courage isn't something you plan for, Thomas. It's something you discover in yourself when there's no other choice. And if you're lucky, you'll have someone beside you who refuses to let you face it alone." He looked at Maggie, and she smiled at him, that same fierce smile she had given him in a general store in Ironstone Town when she had stepped between him and Clayton Ashford and declared that she was not afraid. "That's the real legacy," Samuel said, "not the money or the land or the railroad contract. It's knowing that when darkness comes, you don't face it alone. You face it with the people you love, the people who chose to stand with you even when they had every reason to walk away." "And do you walk away?" William asked. "Never," Samuel and Maggie said together, and they laughed at the synchronization. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the valley in white. Inside, the fire crackled, and 3 generations of the Blackwell family sat together, bound by love and blood and stories that would be told for generations to come. The Ironstone Aquifer continued to flow as it had for millennia, and would for millennia more. The water that had been worth fighting for, worth nearly dying for, continued to give life to the valley. And the house that Samuel and Margaret Blackwell had built stood as a testament to a simple truth: that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by the strongest or the richest or the most powerful, but by ordinary people who refuse to give up, who keep their promises, and who show up for each other even when the world tells them to run. The legacy they left was not measured in acres or dollars or railroad contracts. It was measured in the lives they had touched, the people they had saved, and the family they had built from nothing but courage and stubborn hope. And that Samuel told his grandson as the fire burned low and the snow fell thick outside was the only kind of wealth that truly mattered.